At exactly 10 o'clock in the evening on May 3, 2007, Kate McCann walked into her holiday apartment to check on her sleeping children. 55 seconds later, she was screaming words that would echo around the world. "Someone's taken her." In that 1 minute, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished without a trace. 18 years later, prosecutors say they know exactly who took her. His name is Christian Brückner. But here's the shocking truth. They admit they can never prove it in court. Before we dive deep into this case that has captivated 3 nations and sparked the largest missing person investigation in modern history, if you're ready to uncover the untold details, the hidden evidence, and the shocking revelations that investigators don't want you to know about, hit that subscribe button right now. Welcome to The Untold Crime Cases, where we bring you the stories that haunt investigators and change the way we think about justice. Don't just watch. Become part of our community searching for truth. Subscribe now. 18 years, 6,570 days, 157,680 hours. That's how long the world has been waiting for answers about what happened to a 3-year-old British girl who disappeared from a Portuguese holiday resort while her parents ate dinner just 55 meters away. The case of Madeleine McCann has everything that captures public imagination. A photogenic child with distinctive eyes, professional parents thrust into the spotlight, multiple international investigations, false leads spanning continents, and a named suspect who remains free despite prosecutors claiming they know he's guilty. But this isn't just another missing child case. This is a story that exposed the vulnerabilities in European policing cooperation, revealed the devastating power of media speculation, destroyed reputations, created conspiracy theories that persist to this day, and cost taxpayers over £13.2 million in the British investigation alone. It's a case where 3 countries continue active investigations, where extensive searches were conducted as recently as 2023 and 2024, and where the only named suspect walked out of prison in September 2024 without ever being charged in connection with Madeleine's disappearance. Tonight, we're going to walk through every detail of that fateful evening. We're going to examine the timeline, minute by minute. We're going to explore the evidence that has emerged over 18 years of investigation. We're going to look at the suspect German prosecutors say they cannot convict. And we're going to ask the questions that still don't have answers. This is the complete story of what happened to Madeleine McCann, and why, after nearly 2 decades, the case remains heartbreakingly unsolved. Let's start at the beginning. Because to understand what happened on May 3, 2007, we need to understand the days leading up to that night, the decisions that were made, and the routine that had been established during what should have been a perfect family holiday. Kate and Gerry McCann were both 39 years old in the spring of 2007. Both were accomplished physicians living in Rothley, Leicestershire, a prosperous village in the English Midlands. Gerry was a consultant cardiologist. Kate was a general practitioner who had reduced her hours after the birth of their children. They were, by all accounts, a loving, stable family who had worked hard to build their careers and create a comfortable life. Their family included 3 young children. Madeleine Beth McCann, who everyone called Maddie, was born on May 12, 2003. She was a bright, energetic child, just 9 days away from her 4th birthday when the family departed for Portugal. She had distinctive eyes, a condition called coloboma where part of the iris is missing, creating a keyhole effect. In Madeleine's right eye, there was a distinctive black mark in the blue-green iris. It was a unique identifying feature that would later appear on millions of missing person posters worldwide. The twins, Sean and Amélie, were born in February 2005, making them just 2 years old when the family traveled to Portugal. They were too young to remember the holiday that would define their lives, too young to provide any information about what happened to their sister, too young to understand why their world was about to change forever. The McCann family had booked a week-long holiday at the Mark Warner Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, a small coastal town in Portugal's Algarve region. They arrived on April 28, 2007, a Saturday. The Ocean Club was a popular destination for British families, offering childcare facilities, organized activities, and a relaxed atmosphere where parents could feel their children were safe while they enjoyed some adult relaxation. The resort was built on a hillside overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The accommodation consisted of low-rise apartment blocks, painted in warm Mediterranean colors, scattered among gardens and pathways. The McCann family had been assigned apartment 5A, a ground floor unit in the waterside garden block. The apartment was modest but comfortable, with a living room and kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. The main entrance faced the street, while glass patio doors at the rear opened onto a small patio area that overlooked the resort's pool and tennis courts. The location seemed ideal. The apartment was close to the children's facilities and only a short walk to the tapas restaurant where the resort's evening dining took place. The McCanns could put their children to bed and still enjoy adult conversation over dinner without being far away. It seemed like the perfect setup for a family holiday. The McCanns had traveled to Portugal with a group of friends, couples they had known for years through various connections. There was David and Fiona Payne, both doctors, who had been friends with the McCanns the longest. David was a cardiovascular researcher, and Fiona was a hospital administrator. They had 2 children who were also on the holiday. Then, there was Russell O'Brien, a doctor, and his partner Jane Tanner, a marketing professional. They had 2 young daughters. Matthew Oldfield was a doctor married to Rachel Oldfield, a lawyer, and they had 1 young daughter. Finally, there was Diane Webster, Fiona Payne's mother, who rounded out the group. This group of 9 adults and 8 children became known in the media as the Tapas 7, though there were actually 9 adults total. They would become central figures in one of the most scrutinized investigations in modern history. Their statements would be analyzed. Their timelines would be questioned. Their friendships would be tested. And their decision to leave their children alone in the apartments while they dined would be debated by millions of people around the world. During the first few days of the holiday, the group established a routine that seemed perfectly reasonable within the context of a family resort. The Ocean Club offered evening childcare services called Kids Club, where parents could drop off their children for supervised activities and dinner. But the McCanns and several other families in their group decided not to use this service for the entire week. Instead, they developed their own system. Each evening, they would feed their children dinner, put them to bed in their respective apartments around 7 o'clock in the evening, and then the adults would meet for dinner at the resort's tapas restaurant. The restaurant was an open-air facility near the resort's pool area. From their usual table, the adults could see the apartment block where their children slept, though they couldn't see the actual doors of the apartments. The distance from apartment 5A to the tapas restaurant was approximately 55 meters in a straight line, though the actual walking route along the pathways was slightly longer, taking about 2 to 3 minutes. The adults had arranged a checking system. Throughout the evening, they would take turns leaving the table to walk back to their apartments and look in on their sleeping children. They would enter quietly, verify that the children were sleeping safely, and return to the restaurant to report that everything was fine. This rotation meant that every apartment was checked approximately every 30 minutes. It seemed like a responsible compromise that allowed the adults to enjoy their evening while ensuring their children's safety. There's been much debate about this arrangement. Many people have questioned why the parents didn't simply use the childcare services, or why they didn't bring baby monitors, or why they left their children alone at all. But context is important here. The Ocean Club was designed as a family resort where this kind of arrangement was common. Many British families at the resort were doing the same thing. The apartments were close to the restaurant. The resort felt safe and secure. The children were sleeping. Within the bubble of a holiday resort, the arrangement didn't seem unusual or negligent to those involved. The McCanns had made one specific security decision regarding their apartment. The main entrance, which faced the street, was kept locked at all times. They would lock it when they left for dinner, and it remained locked throughout the evening. However, the glass patio doors at the rear of the apartment were left closed but unlocked. This was a deliberate choice. The patio doors could only be locked from the inside with a key, and the McCanns didn't want to carry keys back and forth during their checking rotations. By leaving the patio doors unlocked, they could slip in quietly, check on the children without fumbling with locks, and slip out again without disturbing anyone. The patio area outside these doors overlooked the pool and tennis courts. There was a low gate that separated the patio from the public areas of the resort, but it wasn't locked. Someone could walk from the pool area, through the gate, and access the patio doors. But again, within the context of a family resort where people wandered freely, this didn't seem like a significant risk. The first few days of the holiday passed without incident. The weather was pleasant. The children enjoyed the pool and the beach. The adults relaxed and caught up with friends. Madeleine attended the resort's kids club during the day on some occasions, where she participated in activities and made crafts. The checking system worked perfectly each evening. Everyone felt comfortable with the arrangement. There was no reason to think anything would go wrong. Thursday, May 3rd, 2007, began like any other day of the holiday. It was the 5th day of their week-long vacation. The weather was warm and sunny. The McCanns spent the day with their children, enjoying the resort facilities. Madeleine attended the kids club in the morning, where she participated in various activities with other children. The family had lunch together and spent the afternoon at the pool. That evening, the routine began as usual. Kate McCann gave the 3 children their baths and put them to bed. Madeleine was wearing Eeyore pajamas, pale pink, with a pattern featuring the sad donkey from Winnie the Pooh. She settled into her bed with her pink comfort blanket and her beloved toy, a stuffed cat she called Cuddle Cat. The twins were placed in their travel cots. All 3 children were asleep by around 7 o'clock in the evening. Kate and Jerry made their final preparations for dinner. They changed into casual evening clothes. They checked that the children were sleeping peacefully. Jerry closed the curtains in the children's bedroom, though he left them slightly open at the sides to allow some light in from the living area, as Madeleine didn't like complete darkness. He pulled the bedroom door nearly closed, leaving it slightly ajar. They locked the main entrance door. They left the patio doors closed but unlocked. And at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, they walked the short distance to the tapas restaurant. The group gathered at their usual table. It was a pleasant evening. The adults ordered drinks and appetizers. The conversation flowed easily. These were close friends who had known each other for years, relaxing together on holiday. There was no sense of foreboding, no intuition that anything was wrong, no reason to think this evening would be different from any other evening of the holiday. The checking rotation began as planned. The timeline of that evening has been reconstructed from multiple witness statements, and while there are some minor discrepancies about exact timing, the general sequence of events is clear. At around 8:30 in the evening, Matthew Oldfield made the first check of the evening. He checked on his own daughter first, then walked past the McCann apartment. He listened at the door but didn't actually enter apartment 5A. He heard nothing concerning and returned to the table to report that everything seemed fine. At approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, it was Jerry McCann's turn to check. He left the table and walked to apartment 5A. He entered through the unlocked patio doors at the rear of the apartment. He walked through the living area toward the children's bedroom. The first thing he noticed was that the bedroom door, which he had left slightly ajar, was now nearly wide open. He found this unusual but not immediately alarming. Perhaps Kate had opened it wider during her preparations. Perhaps the door had swung open on its own. Old apartments often had uneven floors that caused doors to move. Jerry entered the bedroom. All 3 children were in their beds, sleeping peacefully. Madeleine was lying in her usual position, her pink blanket beside her, Cuddle Cat within reach. The twins were in their cots. Everything appeared completely normal. Jerry stood there for a moment, watching his sleeping children in the dim light filtering through the curtains. There was nothing that caused him concern. Nothing that seemed out of place beyond the door being more open than expected. Jerry used the bathroom before leaving the apartment. He pulled the children's bedroom door nearly closed again, leaving it just slightly ajar as before. He exited through the patio doors, closing them behind him. The entire check had taken approximately 5 minutes. He walked back toward the tapas restaurant, feeling completely reassured that his children were safe and sleeping soundly. As Jerry made his way back along the street, he encountered Jeremy Wilkins, another British tourist staying at the resort. The 2 men knew each other slightly and stopped to chat. Wilkins was out for an evening walk with his young son in a stroller. They stood talking on the street corner for several minutes, discussing their holidays, their children, the usual casual conversation between parents on vacation. At approximately 9:15 in the evening, Jane Tanner left the tapas restaurant to check on her own children. She walked up the same street where Jerry McCann and Jeremy Wilkins were standing and talking. She passed within feet of them, though later she couldn't recall if she had acknowledged them or if they had seen her. She was focused on getting to her apartment to check on her daughters. As Jane Tanner walked past the two men, she looked up the street toward the apartments, and she saw something. Something that would become one of the most analyzed sightings in the entire investigation. Something that would generate thousands of reported sightings across Europe and North Africa. Something that would dominate the investigation for the next 6 years. Jane Tanner saw a man carrying a child. The figure was walking across the top of the road, moving away from the McCann apartment and heading toward the outer edge of the resort. The man appeared to be in his mid to late 30s. He was approximately 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 9 inches tall. He had dark hair, possibly collar length. He was wearing dark clothing, possibly beige or tan trousers, and a dark jacket or shirt. Most significantly, he was carrying a young child, and the child appeared to be sleeping or unconscious. The child's arms were hanging limply down. The child was wearing what appeared to be light-colored pajamas, possibly pink, and there might have been a pattern on them, though Tanner couldn't be certain of the details. The man was walking purposefully but not running. He wasn't looking around nervously. He was simply walking as someone might walk if carrying a sleeping child. And that's exactly what Jane Tanner assumed she was seeing. A father carrying his sleeping child back to their apartment. Holiday resorts were full of such sights. Parents often carried sleeping children from one place to another. There was nothing that immediately screamed danger or abduction. Jane Tanner continued to her apartment, checked on her children, and returned to the restaurant. She mentioned to the group that she had seen someone carrying a child. But it was a casual observation, not a worried report. No one thought anything of it. Why would they? Their own children were being checked regularly and were perfectly safe. Except they weren't. At approximately 9:30 in the evening, Matthew Oldfield performed another check. This time he actually entered the McCann apartment through the unlocked patio doors. He walked into the living area and looked toward the children's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. He listened carefully and heard no sounds of distress or movement. He could see through the gap in the door, though his view was partially blocked. He could see the twins' cots, but couldn't see Madeleine's bed from where he stood in the doorway. Everything seemed quiet and peaceful. Matthew Oldfield made a decision that he would question for the rest of his life. He didn't walk into the bedroom. He didn't look directly at Madeleine's bed. He didn't pull back the covers or check more thoroughly. He simply listened, saw nothing concerning, and assumed everything was fine. He closed the patio doors behind him and returned to the restaurant to report that all was well at the McCann apartment. But all was not well. At some point between 9:05, when Jerry McCann checked and saw Madeleine sleeping peacefully, and 10 o'clock, when Kate McCann would make her check, someone had entered apartment 5A and taken Madeleine McCann. The question that has haunted investigators for 18 years is simple. How? At 10 o'clock in the evening, Kate McCann left the tapas restaurant for her turn to check on the children. She walked along the familiar route to apartment 5A. The evening was pleasant, the resort was quiet. There was nothing that caused her any concern as she approached her apartment. She had no reason to think this check would be any different from the dozen other checks they had performed over the past few days. Kate entered through the unlocked patio doors. She walked into the living area. Immediately, she noticed something odd. The children's bedroom door was wide open, wider than they usually left it, wider than Jerry had left it when he pulled it nearly closed. But doors in old apartments sometimes swung open. It didn't immediately trigger alarm. She walked toward the bedroom. As she approached, she noticed something else. There was a breeze. Air was moving through the apartment in a way it shouldn't be. She reached the bedroom doorway and looked inside. The window was open. The window that had been closed when they left for dinner. The window that no one had any reason to open. It was wide open, the curtains moving slightly in the breeze. The twins were in their cots, sleeping peacefully. But Madeleine's bed was empty. For a split second, Kate McCann's mind tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Perhaps Madeleine had gotten up to use the bathroom. Perhaps she had wandered into the other bedroom looking for her parents. Perhaps there was a reasonable explanation. Kate quickly checked the bathroom. Empty. She checked the other bedroom. Empty. She checked under the beds, in the wardrobes, anywhere a small child might hide. Nothing. And then the reality hit her with full force. The open window, the empty bed, the missing child. Kate McCann ran from the apartment, leaving the patio doors wide open behind her. She ran toward the tapas restaurant, her mind barely able to process what was happening. As she got closer to the table where her friends and husband sat, she began to scream. Madeleine's gone. Someone's taken her. Those words shattered the pleasant evening in an instant. Jerry McCann jumped up from the table and ran toward the apartment, Kate right behind him. The other members of the group followed. Within seconds, the resort began to mobilize. Resort staff were alerted. Other guests were informed. A search began immediately. Jerry arrived at apartment 5A and raced into the children's bedroom. He saw exactly what Kate had seen. The open window, the empty bed, the twins still sleeping peacefully in their cots, undisturbed by the commotion. He looked around desperately, hoping for some sign of where Madeleine might be, some indication of what had happened. The window in the children's bedroom told part of the story. It was a metal-framed window that opened upward and outward. The shutters outside the window were also open, rolled all the way up. These shutters could only be raised from the inside of the apartment. Someone had opened the window and the shutters from inside the room. Whether this was how the abductor had left with Madeleine, or simply how they had prepared an escape route, or some other explanation, remained unclear. Within minutes, dozens of people were searching the resort. Resort staff checked storage areas, utility rooms, empty apartments. Guests walked the grounds, calling Madeleine's name. The McCann's friends spread out to search the beach, the streets of the village, anywhere a small child might wander or be hidden. The search was conducted with increasing desperation as the minutes ticked by and there was no sign of the little girl. At approximately 10:41 in the evening, the police were contacted. The call went to the Guarda Nacional Republicana, Portugal's gendarmerie force responsible for areas outside major cities. The first officers arrived at the Ocean Club shortly after 11 o'clock in the evening. They began taking statements and coordinating a more organized search of the area. The Policia Judiciaria, Portugal's judicial police force responsible for criminal investigations, were notified and detectives began arriving after midnight. By the early hours of May 4, 2007, what would become one of the largest missing person investigations in modern history was underway. But the first hours after a child's disappearance are the most critical. The first hours are when witnesses' memories are freshest, when physical evidence hasn't been contaminated, when the child is most likely to be close by and recoverable. And those first hours were marked by confusion, miscommunication, and decisions that would later be heavily criticized. The immediate crime scene was not properly secured. Resort guests and staff had walked through apartment 5A during the initial search. The patio doors had been left open. People had touched surfaces. The bedroom had been entered and exited multiple times before police arrived. When officers finally arrived, they conducted a cursory examination, but didn't immediately treat the apartment as a crime scene, requiring forensic analysis. There was also confusion about the nature of the disappearance. Some initial responders seemed to believe that Madeleine had simply wandered off. Small children did sometimes wake up and go looking for their parents. Perhaps she had left the apartment through the unlocked patio doors and gotten lost in the resort. This theory shaped the early response, with significant resources devoted to searching the resort grounds and the surrounding area rather than treating the case as a likely abduction from the start. The language barrier complicated matters. The McCanns spoke no Portuguese. Most of the responding officers spoke limited English. Important details were lost in translation during those crucial first hours. Questions were misunderstood. Answers were unclear. The nuances of witness statements were difficult to convey across the language divide. By dawn on May 4, 2007, several things had become clear. Madeleine McCann was missing. She had disappeared from a locked apartment while her parents dined 55 meters away. Someone had opened the window and shutters from inside the bedroom, and there were no witnesses who had seen anything clearly suspicious, with the exception of Jane Tanner's sighting of a man carrying a child, though at the time she saw it, She had no reason to think it was connected to an abduction. The search continued through the night and into the next day. Police dogs were brought in. Officers searched the beach, the rocks along the coastline, empty buildings, and vehicles. Divers searched the sea and a nearby reservoir. Nothing was found. It was as if Madeleine had simply vanished into thin air. The media began to arrive. First local Portuguese reporters, then national media from Portugal, then British media, who descended on Praia da Luz in force. By the weekend, the story was international news. The photograph of Madeleine McCann, showing a smiling little girl with distinctive eyes, began to appear on front pages worldwide. Within a week, Madeleine's face was one of the most recognizable in the world. The investigation in those first days focused on several theories. The first and most obvious was stranger abduction. Someone had been watching the apartment, noticed the pattern of the parents leaving in the evening, observed that the patio doors were unlocked, and seized an opportunity to take a child. This was supported by Jane Tanner's sighting of a man carrying a child away from the area at approximately the right time. The second theory was that Madeleine had wandered off. Perhaps she had woken up, found her parents gone, and left through the unlocked patio doors to look for them. Perhaps she had become lost or encountered an accident. This theory led to extensive searches of the area but seemed increasingly unlikely as time passed. A 3-year-old child wandering alone would likely have been seen by someone or would have been found relatively quickly. The third theory, whispered at first and then growing louder as the investigation progressed, was that the parents were somehow involved. This theory would come to dominate much of the media coverage and public speculation, causing immense additional trauma to a family already dealing with unimaginable loss. The Portuguese investigation, led by Gonçalo Amaral of the Polícia Judiciária, began to focus increasingly on the McCanns and their friends. Inconsistencies in the timeline were noted. Questions were raised about the checking system. The decision to leave the children alone was criticized, and eventually, suspicion hardened into accusation. On September 6, 2007, 4 months after Madeleine disappeared, Kate McCann was declared an arguida in the case. This is a Portuguese legal status that falls somewhere between a witness and a suspect, indicating that someone is formally being investigated for possible involvement in a crime. The next day, Jerry McCann was also declared an arguida. The parents of a missing child were now formal suspects in her disappearance. The basis for this suspicion rested largely on results from forensic tests. British cadaver dogs had been brought in to search the apartment and the McCanns' rental car. These dogs allegedly indicated the presence of traces of blood in apartment 5A and the scent of a corpse in the rental car, which the McCanns had rented weeks after Madeleine disappeared. Samples were sent for analysis to the Forensic Science Service in Birmingham, England. The theory that emerged from Portuguese investigators was deeply disturbing. They suggested that Madeleine had died in the apartment, possibly as a result of an accident, and that her parents had disposed of her body, possibly using the rental car to transport it weeks later. This theory required believing that the parents had hidden a body, maintained an elaborate pretense, lied to investigators, and manipulated the media while conducting a worldwide search for a child they knew was dead. The theory had significant problems. The forensic evidence was inconclusive at best. The British laboratory that analyzed the samples reported that the results were not definitive and could not conclusively prove the presence of blood or bodily fluids belonging to Madeleine. The idea that parents could hide a body so effectively that extensive police searches found no trace, while simultaneously maintaining the composure to deceive investigators and the media, seemed far-fetched, and there was no plausible motive. The McCanns were loving parents with no history of violence or child abuse. Nevertheless, the suspicion cast a long shadow over the case. Portuguese media coverage became increasingly hostile toward the McCanns. British tabloid newspapers ran sensational headlines suggesting parental involvement. The court of public opinion was divided, with many people convinced that the parents must know more than they were saying. In July 2008, more than a year after Madeleine disappeared, the Portuguese Attorney General announced that the investigation was being archived. The arguida status was lifted from Kate and Jerry McCann and from Robert Murat, another man who had briefly been a suspect early in the investigation. The announcement stated that there was no evidence of a crime committed by the suspects. The case remained unsolved. The Portuguese investigation had lasted 14 months, involved hundreds of officers, and cost millions of euros. It had generated thousands of pages of witness statements and forensic reports. And it had concluded with no charges, no arrests, and no answers about what happened to Madeleine McCann. But the McCanns refused to accept that the search was over. They had established a fund to support the search for Madeleine, financed by donations from the public. They hired private investigators to continue working on the case. They traveled across Europe, following up on reported sightings. They fought legal battles against Portuguese officials and media outlets that had damaged their reputation. And they campaigned tirelessly to keep Madeleine's case in the public eye. In May 2011, on the 4th anniversary of Madeleine's disappearance, the British government announced that Scotland Yard would conduct a review of the case. Operation Grange, as it was called, was tasked with examining all the evidence and determining if there were any investigative avenues that had been missed. What began as a review soon evolved into a full investigation, with British detectives actively pursuing new leads. Operation Grange brought fresh resources and a different perspective to the case. British investigators identified over 600 potential persons of interest who needed to be traced and eliminated from inquiries. They conducted extensive reviews of cell phone records, trying to identify who had been in the Praia da Luz area on the night of May 3, 2007. They developed new theories about what might have happened. One significant finding from Operation Grange concerned the timeline and the sighting reported by Jane Tanner. British investigators came to believe that the man Tanner saw carrying a child was not connected to Madeleine's disappearance. They identified him as a British holidaymaker who had been carrying his own daughter back from a kids' club. This man, who had been unaware that he might have been witness that night, came forward after Operation Grange made a public appeal. If the Jane Tanner sighting was not the abductor, then what had actually happened? Operation Grange investigators developed a new timeline and a new theory. They believed that the abduction occurred later than previously thought, probably during the period between 9:30 and 10 o'clock in the evening, when Matthew Oldfield checked but didn't actually enter the children's bedroom. British investigators also identified a new sighting that had not been fully investigated by Portuguese police. At approximately 10 o'clock in the evening, around the same time Kate McCann was discovering Madeleine missing, an Irish family named Smith had been walking through Praia da Luz. They saw a man carrying a young child. The man was walking quickly toward the beach, holding the child in his arms. The child appeared to be sleeping or unconscious and was wearing light-colored pajamas. The Smith family thought nothing of it at the time, but after Madeleine's disappearance was reported, they realized they might have witnessed something significant. What made the Smith sighting particularly interesting was the description of the man. He was described as being approximately 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet tall, with a slim build, short brown hair, and wearing beige or light-colored trousers. Martin Smith, the father of the family, later stated that when he saw footage of Jerry McCann carrying one of the twins at the airport when the family returned to England, something about the way he carried the child reminded him of the man he had seen that night. This observation led to significant speculation that the Smith family might have actually seen Jerry McCann carrying his own daughter, feeding theories about parental involvement. However, Operation Grange investigators had a different interpretation. They believed the Smith sighting might be the actual abductor making his escape, carrying Madeleine away from the scene. If this was correct, then the investigation had been focused on the wrong sighting for years, and the real witness evidence that could identify the abductor had been underutilized. Operation Grange conducted extensive investigative work. They traveled to Portugal multiple times. They identified and traced hundreds of individuals who had been in Praia da Luz at the time. They examined thousands of documents and pieces of evidence. They liaised with Portuguese authorities and European law enforcement agencies, and they began to develop persons of interest who needed deeper investigation. The British investigation was expensive. By 2016, it was estimated that Operation Grange had cost over £11 million. By 2020, the cost had exceeded £13.2 million. There was public and political debate about whether this level of resources was justified for a single missing child case, especially one that occurred in another country. But successive British governments continued to fund the investigation, recognizing the enormous public interest in the case and the need to pursue every possible avenue to find Madeleine. The investigation began to focus on patterns of crimes in Portugal's Algarve region around the time of Madeleine's disappearance. Detectives identified a series of break-ins at holiday properties, where lone male intruders had entered apartments and, in some cases, sexually assaulted young girls. These crimes had occurred in the years leading up to and following May 2007. The pattern suggested someone who was targeting properties where tourists with young children were staying. In June 2014, Operation Grange detectives made a significant announcement. They were seeking information about a man they believed had been in the vicinity of apartment 5A on the night Madeleine disappeared. They released EFIT images showing what the man might look like. These were based on descriptions from witnesses, including the Smith family. The images showed a white man with short brown hair, medium build, and a distinctive appearance. The investigation was narrowing. Somewhere out there, British investigators believed, was a man who held the key to what happened to Madeleine McCann. They just needed to identify him. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Your engagement helps us continue investigating these untold crime cases. Hit that like button if you want to see how this investigation finally identified a suspect after 13 years of searching. On June 3, 2020, 13 years after Madeleine McCann disappeared, German prosecutors made a stunning announcement. They had identified a suspect. His name was Christian Brückner, and prosecutors stated they were investigating him for murder in connection with Madeleine's disappearance. More than that, prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters made an extraordinary statement. They believed they knew what had happened to Madeleine, and they believed she was dead. Christian Brückner was a 43-year-old German national with a disturbing criminal history. He was already in prison in Germany, serving a sentence for drug trafficking and the rape of a 72-year-old woman. But it was his past activities in Portugal that had brought him to the attention of investigators working on the Madeleine McCann case. Brückner had lived on and off in the Algarve region of Portugal for many years. He had been in the area of Praia da Luz at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. In fact, phone records showed that his mobile phone received a call near the Ocean Club resort around the time Madeleine was taken. This call, approximately 30 minutes long, was made from a Portuguese mobile number and placed Brückner in the immediate vicinity at the critical time. The investigation into Brückner began years before the public announcement. British investigators had identified him as a person of interest and shared information with German authorities. The investigation intensified as detectives learned more about his background and activities. Brückner had a criminal record dating back to his youth. He had convictions for theft and drug offenses, but more concerning were sexual offenses. In 1994, at age 17, he was investigated for sexually abusing a child in Germany. In 2004, while living in Portugal, he was convicted of sexually abusing a young girl in a playground. He received a sentence but served only part of it before leaving Portugal. In 2016, American authorities charged Brückner in absentia with possession of child sexual abuse material after an investigation revealed he had shared such content online. In 2017, Brückner was convicted in Germany for drug trafficking and sentenced to 15 months in prison. But the conviction that really caught investigators' attention came in December 2019. Brückner was convicted of raping a 72-year-old American woman in her home in Praia da Luz in 2005, just 2 years before Madeleine disappeared. The victim was a tourist staying alone in her holiday apartment when Brückner broke in during the night, tied her up, and brutally assaulted her. The attack lasted hours. The victim survived and provided a statement, but it took years for authorities to connect Brückner to the crime through DNA evidence. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. This conviction was significant for multiple reasons. It proved Brückner was in Praia da Luz, committing serious crimes around the relevant time period. It demonstrated he was capable of breaking into holiday apartments at night. It showed he targeted vulnerable victims in their homes. and it established a pattern of predatory behavior in the exact area where Madeleine McCann disappeared. As investigators dug deeper into Brückner's history, more disturbing information emerged. Between 1995 and 2007, Brückner had lived intermittently in Portugal, supporting himself through various means including theft, drug dealing, and possibly other criminal activities. He lived in a converted farmhouse near Praia da Luz, and also spent time living in a camper van that he parked in various locations around the region. Witnesses came forward, describing Brückner's behavior during this period. He was known to break into hotel rooms and holiday apartments, stealing from tourists. He told people he knew how to break into apartments without leaving traces. He bragged about criminal activities. Some acquaintances described him as unstable, paranoid, and capable of violence when drunk or high on drugs. Investigators obtained evidence that Brückner had been in Praia da Luz on the night of May 3, 2007. Multiple witnesses placed him in the area. His phone records confirmed it. One witness reported seeing his distinctive vehicle, a Volkswagen camper van with yellow and white or possibly beige and white coloring, parked near the Ocean Club Resort in the days leading up to Madeleine's disappearance. Even more significantly, on May 4, 2007, the day after Madeleine disappeared, Brückner re-registered a vehicle in someone else's name. The vehicle was a Jaguar car that he had been using. This action, coming just hours after the most heavily publicized crime in Portugal, struck investigators as potentially significant. Was he trying to distance himself from a vehicle that might connect him to the crime? German prosecutors began building their case. They conducted searches of properties connected to Brückner. In 2020, they excavated land near a former residence in Germany, looking for evidence connected to Madeleine's disappearance. Nothing was found. In 2023, they conducted a major search of a reservoir near Praia da Luz, called Barragem do Arade, approximately 50 kilometers from where Madeleine disappeared. Brückner was known to have visited this reservoir. Divers, ground-penetrating radar, and extensive search teams spent days examining the area. Again, nothing directly connected to Madeleine was found. Investigators also examined materials seized from Brückner over the years. When he was arrested in Italy in 2011 for diesel theft, authorities found USB drives and other storage media in his possession. These contained thousands of images and videos of child sexual abuse. Among this material were videos that Brückner had filmed himself, showing him sexually abusing children and committing other serious crimes. One particularly disturbing piece of evidence came from Brückner's own statements. According to witnesses, Brückner had made comments suggesting knowledge of what happened to Madeleine McCann. In a bar in Germany, after Madeleine disappeared but before he was identified as a suspect, Brückner allegedly made remarks about the case. One witness reported that during a conversation about Madeleine, Brückner said he knew what happened to her, though he didn't elaborate. Another witness claimed Brückner said something to the effect that she didn't scream. In 2017, while watching television coverage of the 10th anniversary of Madeleine's disappearance, Brückner allegedly made disturbing comments to someone he was with. The witness reported that Brückner seemed to have inside knowledge about the case and made statements that suggested involvement. Prosecutors also pointed to Brückner's behavior after Madeleine's disappearance. In the days and weeks following May 3, 2007, Brückner reportedly changed his pattern of behavior. He left Portugal shortly after the disappearance. He disposed of or re-registered vehicles. He moved locations frequently. This behavior was consistent with someone trying to avoid detection. The phone call that Brückner received at 9:27 in the evening on May 3, 2007, became a focal point of the investigation. The call lasted approximately 30 minutes and was made from a Portuguese mobile phone number. The phone that received the call was in the area of Praia da Luz, placing Brückner near the Ocean Club Resort during the critical window when Madeleine disappeared. Investigators never identified who made this call or what was discussed. The Portuguese phone that originated the call was a prepaid mobile that was never traced to a specific individual. German prosecutors Hans Christian Wolters became the public face of the investigation into Brückner. In numerous media interviews, he stated clearly that authorities believed Madeleine McCann was dead, and that they had evidence suggesting Brückner killed her. However, He also acknowledged a critical problem. They could not prove their case beyond reasonable doubt in a German court. This admission was extraordinary. Here was a prosecutor publicly declaring that he knew who committed a crime and what happened to the victim, but simultaneously admitting he couldn't secure a conviction. Wolters explained that while they had circumstantial evidence, witness statements, and behavioral evidence suggesting Brückner's involvement, they lacked the physical proof needed to meet Germany's high evidentiary standards for prosecution. German law requires prosecutors to have a strong likelihood of conviction before bringing charges. Unlike some legal systems where charges can be brought on lesser evidence and tested at trial, German prosecutors must be confident they can prove their case. In Madeleine's case, without a body, without forensic evidence directly linking Brückner to the crime scene, without witnesses who saw him take Madeleine, the evidentiary threshold could not be met. Wolters indicated that what they really needed was one of three things: a confession from Brückner, a witness who could place him at the scene with Madeleine, or physical evidence proving Madeleine's death and connecting it to Brückner. None of these had materialized despite years of investigation. Christian Brückner has consistently denied any involvement in Madeleine's disappearance. Through his lawyers, he has maintained his innocence. He has not cooperated with investigators, providing no statements or explanations about his whereabouts or activities on May 3, 2007. German law allows suspects to remain silent, and Brückner has exercised this right throughout the investigation. The legal situation became even more complicated in September 2024. Brückner completed his sentence for the rape conviction and several other charges. Under German law, he could not be held in prison without being convicted of new crimes. Despite being the prime suspect in one of the world's most famous missing person cases, despite prosecutors believing he was responsible for Madeleine's death, Christian Brückner walked out of prison a free man. His release caused international headlines. The McCanns, who had waited 17 years for answers, saw the only named suspect in their daughter's disappearance released without charges. Prosecutors in Germany, Portugal, and the United Kingdom continued to investigate. But Brückner was free to go wherever he wanted, with restrictions only if he violated parole conditions from his previous convictions. The investigation continues today. All three countries maintain active investigations. The Metropolitan Police's Operation Grange remains open, though funding has been repeatedly reviewed and the team has been scaled down to a small number of core investigators. Portuguese authorities reopened their investigation in 2022 and are working alongside German prosecutors. German authorities continue to build their case against Brückner, hoping to find the evidence needed to bring charges. In 2023, Portuguese investigators conducted searches at the Arade Reservoir based on information that Brückner had been seen there around the time of Madeleine's disappearance. The search, which took place in May 2023, on the 16th anniversary of Madeleine's disappearance, involved divers, specialized search dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and excavation equipment. The reservoir is approximately 30 miles from Praia da Luz. Witnesses had reported seeing Brückner visiting this location. One theory was that he might have disposed of evidence or even Madeleine's body in the deep water. The search lasted several days and examined both the reservoir itself and the surrounding wooded areas. No significant evidence related to Madeleine was found. In 2024, further searches were conducted at a property in Germany connected to Brückner. Again, nothing was found. Each search that ends without finding Madeleine or evidence proving what happened to her adds to the frustration of investigators and the McCann family. The case seems stuck in a terrible limbo where authorities believe they know what happened but cannot prove it. The question of what evidence prosecutors actually have against Brückner remains partially unclear. Much of the investigation remains confidential, as is standard in ongoing criminal cases. German prosecutors have indicated they have evidence they haven't made public, including witness statements and other materials that they believe point to Brückner's guilt, but aren't sufficient alone to secure a conviction. They've stated they believe Madeleine died shortly after being taken from apartment 5A, but they haven't disclosed what evidence supports this belief. Some aspects of the evidence that have become public are circumstantial but compelling when viewed together. Brückner was in the area. His phone places him near the scene at the critical time. He had a history of breaking into holiday apartments in that area. He had a pattern of sexual offenses against young girls. He made statements suggesting knowledge of the crime. He changed his behavior immediately after the disappearance. His living situation and lifestyle would have allowed him to commit such a crime without easy detection. He had the means, opportunity, and based on his criminal history, arguably, the motive. But circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling it might seem, must reach a high threshold in criminal court. Defense lawyers would attack each piece of evidence. They would argue that being in the area doesn't prove commission of a crime. That phone records show location, but not activity. That statements to witnesses could be interpreted differently or might not be reliable given the witnesses' own backgrounds. That behavior changes could have innocent explanations. That criminal history doesn't prove involvement in a specific crime. Without physical evidence or witnesses to the actual abduction, a defense attorney could create reasonable doubt. The investigation has also looked at whether Brückner had accomplices. Some witnesses reported that Brückner associated with other criminal figures during his time in Portugal. One theory is that Brückner might have taken Madeleine for someone else, possibly as part of a child trafficking operation. However, no evidence has emerged supporting this theory, and prosecutors seem to believe Brückner acted alone. Another area of investigation concerns Brückner's activities in the hours and days after May 3, 2007. Where did he go? What did he do? Who did he see? Investigators have tried to reconstruct his movements, but years after the fact, with Brückner uncooperative and many potential witnesses deceased or with faded memories, creating a complete picture has proven impossible. The digital evidence from Brückner's seized devices has been thoroughly analyzed. Investigators found disturbing material demonstrating his predatory behavior toward children, but nothing specifically related to Madeleine McCann. No photographs of her, no references to her disappearance, no evidence that would directly prove his involvement in her abduction. The absence of such evidence could actually be seen as significant. Brückner was careful enough not to keep incriminating material, or Madeleine's case was different somehow from his other crimes. The investigation has also examined Brückner's finances. How did he support himself? Did he have unusual income or expenses around the time of Madeleine's disappearance? Financial records from that period are incomplete, but what exists shows Brückner lived a marginal lifestyle, earning money through petty crime and occasional work. There's no evidence of large sums of money that might suggest he was paid to abduct a child, which weakens theories about trafficking or abduction for ransom. Psychological profiles of Brückner have been developed by investigators. Criminal psychologists have analyzed his known behavior patterns, his criminal escalation over time, and his personal history. These profiles suggest someone capable of impulsive violent behavior when under the influence of drugs or alcohol, someone with sexual attraction to children, someone comfortable with breaking and entering, someone who took risks, but also took steps to avoid detection. The profile fits someone who might opportunistically abduct a child from an apartment if they discovered an easy target. But again, psychological profiles are tools for investigation, not evidence for prosecution. They can help investigators understand likely behavior and focus their efforts, but they don't prove guilt in court. The case has raised significant questions about European law enforcement cooperation. When Madeleine disappeared in 2007, information sharing between police forces in different European countries was less developed than it is today. Christian Brückner had a criminal record spanning multiple countries, but this information wasn't easily accessible to Portuguese police investigating in Praia da Luz. If better systems had been in place, would Brückner have been identified as a suspect sooner? Would evidence have been preserved that might have proven his involvement? These questions remain unanswered but have led to improvements in how European countries share criminal intelligence. The financial cost of the investigation has been staggering. The British Operation Grange alone has cost over £13.2 million. The Portuguese investigation cost millions of euros. The German investigation continues to consume resources. These figures have led to public debate about the allocation of police resources. Should one missing child case consume so much money and so many investigative hours when other cases receive far less attention? The answer often given is that the unique circumstances of Madeleine's case, the international dimension, and the enormous public interest justify the expenditure. But the debate continues, especially as the case remains unsolved despite the massive investment. The media coverage of Madeleine's case has been unlike almost any other missing person investigation. Her face became one of the most recognizable in the world. The case generated thousands of news articles, hundreds of hours of television coverage, documentaries, books, and endless online discussion. This attention had both positive and negative effects. On the positive side, it kept the case in the public eye, generated tips and information, and put pressure on authorities to continue investigating. On the negative side, it led to wild speculation, conspiracy theories, false sightings, and immense additional stress on the McCann family. Kate and Jerry McCann have lived for 18 years with the unimaginable pain of not knowing what happened to their daughter. They've endured suspicion, accusation, media harassment, and public speculation about their involvement. They've been vindicated legally, multiple times, with Portuguese authorities clearing them of suspicion and courts ruling in their favor in defamation cases against those who accuse them of involvement. But public opinion has remained divided, with some people still believing the parents must know more than they've said. The McCanns have devoted their lives to finding Madeleine. They've traveled the world following up on sightings. They've met with investigators, psychics, private detectives, and anyone who claimed to have information. They've maintained the Madeleine Fund to support the search. They've fought legal battles to protect their reputation. They've advocated for improvements in how missing children cases are handled. And through it all, they've raised their twin children, Sean and Amelie, trying to provide them with as normal a life as possible while living under the shadow of their sister's disappearance. The twins, who were just 2 years old when Madeleine disappeared, are now adults in their 20s. They were too young to remember that night in Praia da Luz. They've grown up knowing their sister only through photographs and stories. They've lived their entire lives with media attention and public scrutiny. They've shown remarkable resilience. But the impact on them of growing up as the siblings of the world's most famous missing child is impossible to fully measure. The case has generated countless theories over the 18 years since Madeleine disappeared. Beyond the official lines of investigation, amateur detectives, conspiracy theorists, and armchair investigators have proposed numerous alternative explanations. Some theories are based on misinterpretations of evidence. Some are based on speculation without factual foundation. Some are deliberately harmful, accusing innocent people of involvement. One persistent theory suggests Madeleine was abducted as part of an organized child trafficking ring and is still alive somewhere, possibly unaware of her true identity. This theory is based on reports of child trafficking operations in Europe and the fact that no body has been found. However, law enforcement agencies have found no evidence supporting this theory. The characteristics of Madeleine's disappearance, particularly the opportunistic nature and high risk of the abduction from an occupied apartment, don't match typical trafficking patterns. Traffickers usually target vulnerable children without families actively searching for them, not high-profile cases that generate massive international attention. Another theory suggests a local perpetrator, possibly someone working at the Ocean Club Resort, who had access to information about which apartments contained young children and whose movements wouldn't attract suspicion. This theory has some logical appeal, but extensive investigation of resort staff and others with access to the premises has not identified any viable suspects other than Brückner, who had no official connection to the resort. Some theories have focused on the timing of the checks and the question of whether the timeline reported by the McCanns and their friends is accurate. These theories suggest Madeleine might have disappeared earlier in the evening than reported, or that someone in the group knows more than they've disclosed. However, multiple witness statements from people not part of the group, including restaurant staff and other guests, support the timeline as reported. The suggestion that 9 adults would maintain a false timeline for 18 years, with no one breaking ranks or contradicting the story, seems implausible. The most harmful theories are those that continue to suggest the McCanns were involved in Madeleine's death and covered it up. These theories have been thoroughly investigated and rejected by law enforcement. They're contradicted by evidence, by logic, and by what we know about the McCann family. Yet they persist online, causing continued pain to a family that has already suffered immeasurably. The case has had broader impacts beyond the immediate investigation. It's changed how many parents think about holiday safety. The idea of leaving children alone in a hotel room or apartment, even with regular checks, has become much less acceptable in many countries. Holiday companies have improved their childcare services and monitoring systems. Police forces have improved their protocols for responding to missing children reports, particularly in tourist areas. The case has also highlighted issues around media coverage of criminal investigations. The intense media scrutiny, particularly the way Portuguese media initially covered the case and the way British tabloids later pursued various theories, has been criticized for potentially interfering with the investigation and causing harm to innocent people. Some journalists and media organizations have faced legal consequences for their coverage, including defamation judgments in favor of the McCanns. The development of age progression technology has allowed investigators to show what Madeleine might look like now. On significant anniversaries of her disappearance, new age-progressed images have been released, showing how she might appear at various ages. These images have generated renewed public interest and new potential sightings, though none have led to finding Madeleine. If she is still alive, she would now be 21 years old, an adult who might have no memory of her early childhood or her real identity. The question of whether Madeleine is alive remains central to the case. German prosecutors state they believe she died shortly after being taken. British investigators have said they're keeping an open mind. Kate and Gerry McCann have said they won't give up hope while there's no proof of death. The absence of a body, the absence of any physical evidence proving death, leaves open the possibility, however slim, that Madeleine survived. If Madeleine is alive, where could she be? This question has driven thousands of reported sightings over 18 years. She's been seen in dozens of countries across Europe, North Africa, South America, and beyond. Each credible sighting has been investigated. DNA samples have been taken from young women who thought they might be Madeleine or who were reported as possible matches. None have proven to be her. The reality is that a child taken at age 3 and raised by abductors would likely have no memory of their early life and no reason to question the identity they've been given. Finding such a person would require extraordinary luck or a breakthrough in the investigation that provides specific location information. The investigation into Christian Brückner has explored his contacts and associates, looking for anyone who might have helped him if he did abduct Madeleine. One focus has been on his communications in the days and weeks after May 3, 2007. Who did he call? Who did he meet with? Did he say anything to anyone that might provide evidence of his involvement? Some witnesses have come forward with information, but much of it is second-hand, unverifiable, or ambiguous. The kind of clear, direct evidence needed for prosecution has not emerged from this line of inquiry. Investigators have also looked at whether there might be other victims. If Brückner abducted and killed Madeleine, did he commit similar crimes before or after? The known sexual offenses against young girls in Portugal, including the cases where he broke into holiday properties, show a pattern of predatory behavior, but authorities haven't identified other missing children cases that clearly connect to Brückner. This could mean Madeleine's case was unique in his criminal history, or it could mean other crimes haven't been connected to him yet. The advances in forensic technology since 2007 have raised questions about whether evidence from the original investigation could be re-examined with modern techniques. DNA analysis, for example, has become far more sophisticated. Could samples that were inconclusive in 2007 yield results now? British and Portuguese authorities have reviewed forensic evidence, but no breakthrough has been announced. The challenge is that any physical evidence from apartment 5A was potentially contaminated during the chaotic first hours after Madeleine's disappearance, when many people entered the crime scene before it was properly secured. The legal situation remains complex across 3 jurisdictions. British law, Portuguese law, and German law all differ in their requirements for prosecution. The question of where charges would be filed if sufficient evidence emerged is complicated by jurisdictional issues. The crime occurred in Portugal, but the victim was British, and the suspect is German. International legal cooperation would be necessary for any prosecution, and differences between the legal systems could create challenges. German authorities have indicated they're treating the case as a murder investigation, not a missing person case. This is significant because it means they're looking for evidence of death, not evidence of abduction or imprisonment. It suggests they have information, not made public, that leads them to believe Madeleine died. The nature of this information remains a closely guarded aspect of the investigation. The emotional toll on everyone involved in this case has been profound. The McCann family has lived with loss and uncertainty for 18 years. The investigators who have worked on the case have devoted years of their professional lives to solving it, dealing with the frustration of leads that go nowhere and evidence that falls just short of what's needed. The witnesses who saw something that night carry the burden of wondering if they could have done something differently. The resort staff and other holidaymakers who were there have had their memories of a pleasant vacation forever shadowed by tragedy. The wider community of Praia da Luz was deeply affected by Madeleine's disappearance. The small town became the focus of international media attention. Tourism was impacted. Residents were questioned repeatedly. The town's reputation was affected. While life has returned to normal in many ways, the case remains part of the town's history and identity. The case has inspired changes in law enforcement approaches to missing children. The rapid mobilization of resources, the coordination between countries, the use of media to generate leads, and the sustained long-term investigation have all provided lessons that have been applied to other cases. While Madeleine's case remains unsolved, some of the techniques and approaches developed during the investigation have helped solve other cases. The question of closure remains central for the McCann family, and for everyone who has followed this case. Without knowing what happened to Madeleine, without recovering her body if she's dead, without bringing anyone to justice, true closure is impossible. Kate McCann has spoken about the torture of not knowing, of imagining both the best and worst possibilities, of being unable to properly grieve or properly hope. The 18th anniversary of Madeleine's disappearance in May 2025 brought renewed media attention and renewed appeals for information. The Metropolitan Police released a statement confirming the investigation remains active. German prosecutors confirmed they're still pursuing their case against Christian Brückner. Portuguese authorities confirmed their investigation continues. All three countries remain committed to finding answers, but all three also acknowledge the challenges they face in moving the case forward. Public interest in the case remains high. Documentaries continue to be produced. News articles are written on every anniversary. Online communities continue to discuss the evidence and debate theories. The image of Madeleine McCann, the smiling little girl with distinctive eyes, remains one of the most recognizable faces connected to an unsolved case. The advances in technology since 2007 offer some hope for future breakthroughs. Cell phone tracking is more sophisticated. DNA analysis is more sensitive. Facial recognition technology could potentially identify someone in photographs or videos. Digital forensics can recover deleted files and communications. Social media and the internet have created new ways to spread information and generate leads. These tools weren't available or weren't as advanced in 2007. They offer possibilities for reviewing old evidence with new eyes and new capabilities. The international cooperation between police forces has improved dramatically since 2007. European Union initiatives have made it easier for authorities in different countries to share information and coordinate investigations. Database systems allow faster checking of criminal records across borders. The lessons learned from Madeleine's case have contributed to these improvements, even though the case itself remains unsolved. The psychological aspects of the case continue to fascinate criminal profilers and forensic psychologists. What kind of person abducts a child from an occupied apartment in a busy resort? What level of risk tolerance and criminal confidence does that require? What planning versus opportunism is involved? How does such a person behave afterward, knowing they're connected to one of the most publicized crimes in history? Understanding these psychological aspects helps create a profile of the likely perpetrator, and that profile matches what is known about Christian Brückner in many ways. The financial aspects of child abduction cases have been studied extensively since Madeleine's disappearance. The McCann case demonstrated that massive resources can be mobilized when the circumstances are right. An attractive victim, professional parents who can articulate their case effectively, media interest, and political will to support the investigation. But other missing children don't receive the same level of attention or resources, leading to difficult questions about equality and justice. Why should one missing child receive £13 million of investigation funding while another receives far less? There are no easy answers to these questions, but they've sparked important conversations about how society responds to missing children. The role of social media in modern criminal investigations was still emerging when Madeleine disappeared. Facebook had only recently launched. Twitter didn't exist yet. YouTube was in its infancy. If Madeleine disappeared today, the investigation would look very different, with social media playing a central role in spreading information, gathering tips, and maintaining public attention. The McCann case was one of the last major cases from the pre-social media era, and one of the first to transition into the social media age as it continued. The question of hope versus reality is something the McCann family navigates every day. How do you maintain hope that your child is alive after 18 years when prosecutors in 3 countries tell you they believe she's dead? How do you balance that hope with the need to live your life, to be present for your other children, to function in the world? Kate and Jerry McCann have spoken about finding a way to live with ambiguity, to accept that they may never know what happened while continuing to search for answers. The legal battles the McCanns have fought to protect their reputation and privacy have set precedents in multiple countries. They successfully sued Portuguese police officer Gonçalo Amaral for defamation after he published a book claiming they were involved in Madeleine's death. They won settlements from multiple British newspapers for false reporting. These cases established that even in high-profile criminal cases, there are limits to what can be published without evidence, and that victims' families have rights that must be protected. The impact on police resources and policy continues to be debated. Should unsolved cases continue to receive active investigation indefinitely? At what point do the resources devoted to one case become unjustifiable compared to other demands on police time and budget? These questions have no universal answers, but they're asked whenever funding for Operation Grange comes up for review. The counter-argument is that giving up on solving a case sends a message that some crimes don't matter and that the passage of time shouldn't mean justice becomes impossible. The generation of children, who were young when Madeleine disappeared, are now adults themselves, many with children of their own. For them, this case has been part of their entire lives. They grew up seeing Madeleine's face on posters, hearing about the case on news broadcasts, and learning from parents about stranger danger and safety precautions. The case has shaped how an entire generation thinks about child safety, even if they don't consciously realize the connection. The comparison to other famous unsolved cases is inevitable. Madeleine's disappearance shares characteristics with other cases that have captured sustained public attention. Ambiguous circumstances, multiple theories, international dimensions, and families who refuse to give up. Each unsolved case carries its own particular tragedy, but they share the common thread of questions without answers, families without closure, and investigations that continue despite enormous challenges. The possibility of a deathbed confession or a late witness coming forward remains. Some cases have been solved decades after the crime, when someone with guilty knowledge finally decides to speak. Christian Brückner is currently 48 years old. If he is responsible for Madeleine's disappearance, will he ever admit it? Will circumstances change that might motivate him to provide information? Or will he take whatever knowledge he has to his grave? These questions hang over the investigation, as they do in many unsolved cases. The spiritual and emotional dimensions of the case have been profound for Kate McCann in particular. A devout Catholic, she has spoken about her faith and how it has helped her survive the ordeal. The question of how a loving God could allow such suffering has been something she's grappled with publicly. Her book about Madeleine's disappearance provided insight into her inner struggle to maintain faith and hope in the face of devastating loss. The media's role in the case remains controversial. On one hand, the massive publicity kept the case alive, generated tips, and put pressure on authorities to continue investigating. On the other hand, the intrusive coverage, the speculation, the false accusations, and the treatment of the McCanns during the period when they were considered suspects caused immense additional suffering. The case has been used as an example in journalism ethics courses and discussions about responsible crime reporting. The technological footprint that didn't exist in 2007 would have been invaluable. Security cameras were far less common in Portugal then than they are now. Digital photo sharing was limited. Cell phone data was less detailed. Social media didn't exist to capture and share information in real time. If the same circumstances occurred today, the investigation would have far more data to work with, for better or worse. The question of whether Madeleine's case would have been solved if it happened now is impossible to answer, but the additional data would certainly have provided more leads to pursue. The anniversary appeals for information continue to generate responses from the public. On significant anniversaries, when the case is featured in media coverage, police receive dozens or even hundreds of new tips. Most prove to be mistaken sightings or information already known to investigators. But each tip must be evaluated. Each potential lead must be assessed. The hope is that somewhere in the mass of information, there might be the one piece that solves the case. Christian Brückner's release from prison in September 2024 was a bitter moment for everyone seeking justice for Madeleine. The man German prosecutors say they believe abducted and killed her walked free because they cannot prove it in court. The requirement that prosecutors must prove their case beyond reasonable doubt is a cornerstone of justice systems, protecting innocent people from wrongful conviction. But in this case, it means someone who may be responsible for a child's death cannot be held accountable. The investigation continues to look at whether there are other avenues that haven't been fully explored. Are there witnesses who haven't been found or haven't come forward? Is there evidence that was collected but not properly analyzed? Are there connections between pieces of information that haven't been made? The investigators working on the case now are reviewing everything with fresh eyes, looking for something that might have been missed. The cost in terms of investigative hours is incalculable. Thousands of hours have been devoted to this case by hundreds of investigators across 3 countries over 18 years. If those hours had been spent on other cases, how many might have been solved? It's an uncomfortable question, but one that arises in discussions about how police resources should be allocated. The answer usually given is that each case deserves the resources necessary to solve it, and that giving up on Madeleine would be giving up on justice itself. The possibility that the case will never be solved is something everyone involved has had to consider. Despite the massive investigation, despite having a named suspect, despite believing they know what happened, prosecutors may never be able to prove it. The frustration of knowing but not being able to act is profound for investigators. The reality of never knowing for certain what happened to their daughter is something the McCanns must live with every day. The case has become part of popular culture in ways that make some people uncomfortable. There are songs, artwork, online discussions, and even dark humor referencing Madeleine's disappearance. For the McCann family, seeing their daughter's tragedy treated as entertainment or fodder for conspiracy theories is deeply painful. Yet, they've also used popular culture to keep the case alive, participating in documentaries and interviews to ensure Madeleine isn't forgotten. The twins, Sean and Amalie, have expressed their wish for privacy as they've grown up. They've lived their entire lives defined by their sister's disappearance, and they understandably want to be seen as individuals in their own right. The balance between keeping Madeleine's case alive and allowing her siblings to live their own lives is something the McCann family navigates carefully. The international cooperation that has characterized the investigation is somewhat unusual in criminal cases. Usually, jurisdiction and legal boundaries create clear lines about which country investigates and prosecutes. The Madeleine McCann case has required ongoing collaboration between British, Portuguese, and German authorities, each working under their own legal systems, but sharing information and coordinating efforts. This cooperation has been imperfect at times, with criticism about delays in sharing information and differences in investigative approaches. But it has also demonstrated what's possible when countries work together on complex criminal cases. The evidence that prosecutors in Germany say they have, but cannot use in court, raises interesting legal questions. What constitutes sufficient evidence? How does circumstantial evidence, witness statements, and behavioral analysis combine to create proof? These are fundamental questions of law and justice that the Madeleine McCann case illustrates in stark terms. The fact that prosecutors can believe they know what happened but cannot prove it highlights the high bar that exists, appropriately, for criminal conviction. The personal toll on investigators who have worked on this case for years should not be underestimated. Some have devoted their entire careers to finding Madeleine. They've traveled the world, interviewed thousands of witnesses, followed countless leads, and invested emotionally in solving a case that has no easy answers. The frustration of being unable to bring closure to the McCann family weighs heavily on dedicated investigators who know they may retire without ever solving the case that has defined their professional lives. The question of what happens next is something everyone asks. With Christian Brückner released from prison, with no new major breaks in the case, with 18 years already passed, what are the realistic prospects for solving this mystery? German prosecutors maintain they're still building their case, still hoping to find the evidence that will allow them to charge Brückner. British investigators say they're still actively working on leads. Portuguese authorities say they remain committed to the investigation, but without a significant breakthrough, the case could remain in this limbo indefinitely. The role of forensic evidence, or rather, the lack of conclusive forensic evidence, has been critical in this case. The initial forensic examination of apartment 5A was hampered by contamination from the many people who entered before it was properly secured. The samples that were collected and analyzed produced inconclusive or disputed results. The absence of Madeleine's body means there's no crime scene that can provide the kind of physical evidence that often proves crucial in solving serious crimes. This absence of physical evidence is the main reason why, despite strong suspicions about Christian Brückner, prosecutors cannot charge him. The behavioral analysis of the crime has provided insights that support the theory of Brückner's involvement. The crime required someone familiar with the area, someone comfortable breaking into occupied properties, someone willing to take significant risks, someone with a sexual interest in young children, and someone capable of acting quickly and decisively. This profile matches Brückner's known characteristics and criminal history. But again, behavioral analysis can guide an investigation, but cannot prove guilt in court. The impact of this case on the McCann family's extended family and friends has been significant. The 7 friends who were on holiday with them, the Tapas 7, have lived with guilt over the decision to leave the children alone, even though they were following a system they believed was safe. They've been questioned repeatedly by investigators and by the media. Their friendship with the McCanns has been tested by the enormous pressure of the investigation and public scrutiny. Some relationships have survived. Others have been strained by the years of questioning and attention. The role of private investigators hired by the McCanns has been controversial at times. The family has worked with several private investigation firms over the years, using money from the Madeleine Fund to continue searching when official investigations seemed to slow down. Some of these private investigators produced useful information that was shared with police. Others pursued theories that proved fruitless or even harmful. The relationship between private investigations and official police work is always complex, and in this case, it's been especially challenging given the international nature of the case and the different legal systems involved. The question of whether justice can ever be served in this case depends on how we define justice. If justice means someone being held accountable in a court of law for what happened to Madeleine, that may never happen unless significant new evidence emerges. If justice means finding out the truth about what happened, that's possible, but far from certain. If justice means ensuring Madeleine is never forgotten and that every possible effort is made to find answers, then perhaps some measure of justice has been achieved through the sustained investigation and public attention. The comparison between the resources devoted to Madeleine's case and those devoted to other missing children remains a source of debate and sometimes criticism. Children from less privileged backgrounds, children whose parents lack media sophistication, children whose cases don't capture public imagination for whatever reason, often receive far less investigative attention. This inequality is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but important to address. The Madeleine McCann case has highlighted these disparities and prompted discussions about how to ensure all missing children receive appropriate investigative resources. The role of Madeleine's appearance in the public attention her case received cannot be ignored. She was a photogenic child, with distinctive, memorable eyes. The photographs of her smiling face created an emotional connection with millions of people. If Madeleine had been less photogenic, if the family photographs had been less appealing, would the case have received the same level of attention? It's an uncomfortable question, but one that speaks to how society responds to missing children based on factors that have nothing to do with the worthiness of the child or the pain of the family. The advances in age progression technology mean that current images of what Madeleine might look like at 21 years old, are more sophisticated and realistic than earlier attempts. Experts can now factor in family genetics, creating images that show how a person might age based on their parents' and siblings' appearances. These images are distributed through police channels, posted online, and shared through media coverage. They keep hope alive that someone might recognize Madeleine if she's still alive, even if she has no memory of her true identity. The psychological impact on Kate and Jerry McCann of living with uncertainty for 18 years is difficult for anyone who hasn't experienced similar trauma to truly understand. They exist in a state of ambiguous loss, unable to grieve fully because they don't know if Madeleine is dead, unable to hope fully because all evidence suggests she's gone. They've had to find a way to function, to parent their other children, to maintain their marriage under extraordinary stress, and to keep living while a part of their lives remains frozen in May 2007. The criticism the McCanns faced, particularly in the early years after Madeleine disappeared, was vicious at times. They were accused of involvement in their daughter's death. They were criticized for leaving the children alone. Their behavior was analyzed and questioned. Their emotions were scrutinized. People who had never met them felt entitled to judge their parenting, their characters, and their actions. The McCanns have spoken about the additional trauma of being suspected and accused while grieving for their missing daughter. They've described feeling like they were victims twice, once of whoever took Madeleine, and again of the suspicion and accusations that followed. The legal vindication the McCanns eventually received was important, but couldn't undo the damage of the accusations. Portuguese authorities formally cleared them of any involvement. Courts ruled in their favor in defamation cases. Apologies were issued by some media outlets. But the conspiracy theories persisted online, and some people continued to believe, despite the lack of evidence, that the parents were somehow involved. Combating misinformation and conspiracy theories in the internet age is nearly impossible, and the McCanns continue to deal with false accusations even today. The question of whether Madeleine would want to be found, if she's alive and has been raised by someone else, is philosophically complex. If a person has no memory of their early childhood and believes themselves to be someone else, is it in their interest to have that identity destroyed? Would learning the truth be traumatic or liberating? These questions have no easy answers, but they're relevant to discussions about what finding Madeleine might actually mean at this point, 18 years later. The DNA databases that exist today but didn't exist in the same form in 2007 offer some hope. If Madeleine is alive and ever provides DNA for any reason, perhaps a medical test or genealogical research, it could potentially be matched to her family. The expansion of consumer DNA testing has solved other long-standing mysteries by connecting people to relatives they didn't know they had. It's a slim hope, but it's a possibility that didn't exist 2 decades ago. The investigation has generated an enormous archive of documents, statements, evidence, and analysis. These files contain thousands of pages and represent the work of hundreds of investigators over 18 years. The question of what happens to this archive, how it's preserved, and whether it will ever be fully public is relevant for historians and anyone interested in understanding how complex international investigations work. Some information has been released through Freedom of Information requests and court proceedings. Much remains confidential, either because it's part of an ongoing investigation or because it contains sensitive personal information. The lessons learned from this case about how to handle missing children investigations have been applied to other cases. The importance of securing crime scenes immediately, the value of international cooperation, the role of media in generating leads, the need for sustained long-term investigation, and the challenges of working across different legal systems have all been analyzed and incorporated into training and procedures. If nothing else, Madeleine's case has helped improve how similar cases are handled in the future. The emotional weight of this case affects not just those directly involved, but anyone who has followed it closely over the years. People who were young adults when Madeleine disappeared are now middle-aged. People who had young children then now have adult children. The passage of time is marked by this case in a way that few other crimes achieve. Each anniversary becomes a moment of reflection about time passing, about unresolved questions, and about the persistence of hope against overwhelming odds. The possibility of new technology providing answers is real. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are being applied to cold cases, analyzing patterns and connections that human investigators might miss. Satellite imagery and geolocation data that didn't exist or wasn't available in 2007 might be able to track movements or identify locations relevant to the case. DNA phenotyping can create images of what someone looks like based on genetic material. These technologies offer possibilities for future breakthroughs. The role of public engagement with the case has evolved over 18 years. In 2007, engagement meant watching news reports, buying newspapers, and perhaps calling tip lines. Today, engagement happens through social media, online forums, podcasts, and YouTube videos. This democratization of information has both positive and negative aspects. More people can contribute ideas and information, but misinformation and conspiracy theories also spread more easily. The challenge for investigators is separating useful information from noise in an environment where everyone with internet access can be an amateur detective. The financial transparency of the Madeleine Fund has been important in maintaining public trust and support. The fund's accounts are publicly available, showing how donations have been spent on private investigators, legal fees, media campaigns, and other efforts to find Madeleine. This transparency has helped counter suggestions that the fund was being misused, though even with full transparency, some critics have questioned spending decisions. The fund continues to receive donations, though at much lower levels than in the early years after Madeleine disappeared. The impact on tourism in Praia da Luz was significant in the immediate aftermath of Madeleine's disappearance, but has lessened over time. The town struggled with its association with such a tragic event, particularly given that tourism is the economic foundation of the community. Gradually, as years passed and the immediate media presence faded, tourism recovered. Today, Praia da Luz is again a popular destination for British and European tourists, though the case remains part of the town's history and is remembered by long-time residents and those who work in tourism. The question of closure is complicated by the fact that 3 different jurisdictions are investigating with potentially different conclusions. German prosecutors say they believe Madeleine is dead. British investigators maintain they're keeping an open mind about whether she might be alive. Portuguese authorities have reopened their investigation without publicly stating a conclusion about whether this is a murder investigation or a missing person case. These different approaches reflect different legal systems, different evidential standards, and different investigative philosophies. For the McCann family, this lack of unified conclusion makes closure even more difficult. The role of coincidence versus significance in the evidence is something investigators must constantly evaluate. Christian Brückner being in the area when Madeleine disappeared could be coincidence, given that he lived in the region. The phone call he received at the relevant time could be unrelated to the crime. His behavioral changes after May 3rd could have other explanations. Each piece of evidence individually can be explained away. It's the accumulation of coincidences and the pattern they form that creates suspicion. But suspicion, even strong suspicion, is not proof sufficient for criminal conviction. The families of other missing children have sometimes looked to the Madeleine McCann case as inspiration for their own searches. They've seen how sustained attention, proper funding, and refusal to give up can keep a case alive for years. But they've also seen the challenges, the emotional toll, the media intrusion, the public speculation, and the reality that even with all these resources, the case remains unsolved. It's a double-edged lesson about persistence and about the limits of what determination alone can achieve. The role of expert consultants in the investigation has included forensic specialists, criminal profilers, technology experts, and others with specialized knowledge. These consultants have analyzed evidence, provided opinions on likely scenarios, and helped investigators understand complex aspects of the case. Their work has been valuable, but also sometimes controversial, when different experts reach different conclusions from the same evidence. The case has become a study in how expert testimony works, how certainty is communicated, and how conflicting expert opinions are resolved. The passage of 18 years means that some witnesses have died, some have developed memory problems, and all have had their memories potentially affected by media coverage and the passage of time. A witness who might have provided crucial information in 2007 might no longer be able to accurately recall details now. This degradation of witness reliability over time is a significant challenge for cold case investigations and is particularly acute in a case that has had as much media coverage as Madeleine's disappearance. The question of whether the massive publicity helped or hindered the investigation is debated among experts. The publicity generated thousands of tips, kept pressure on authorities to continue investigating, and ensured significant resources were devoted to the case. But it also created challenges: false sightings, conspiracy theories, interference with investigations, and potential contamination of witness memories as people absorbed media narratives about what might have happened. On balance, most investigators believe the publicity has been more helpful than harmful. But the question isn't settled. The future of the investigation depends on several factors: continued political will to fund it, the emergence of new evidence or witnesses, advances in technology that might allow re-examination of existing evidence, and decisions by prosecutors about whether they have enough to charge Christian Brückner despite their acknowledged evidentiary challenges. The investigation could continue for many more years, or it could be wound down if authorities conclude that no further progress is possible without new breakthroughs. The symbolic importance of the Madeleine McCann case extends beyond the specifics of what happened to one child. It represents every parent's nightmare: doing something that seems reasonable and safe, only to have it result in tragedy. It represents the vulnerability of children and the evil that exists in the world. It represents the limitations of law enforcement, even with enormous resources. And it represents the resilience of a family that has endured unimaginable pain without giving up hope or breaking down completely. The McCann family's advocacy work on behalf of missing children has been significant. They've worked to improve alert systems when children go missing, to enhance cooperation between police forces in different countries, and to support other families dealing with missing children. This work has given them purpose and has created positive outcomes from their tragedy, even though it cannot bring Madeleine back or answer their questions about what happened to her. The question of what Christian Brückner knows and why he hasn't spoken is central to the current state of the investigation. If he's responsible, does he feel guilt or remorse? Does he want to confess but fear the consequences? Does he take satisfaction in knowing what happened while others suffer in uncertainty? Is he simply exercising his legal right to remain silent? These psychological questions are unanswerable without his cooperation, which has not been forthcoming and may never come. The possibility of someone other than Brückner being responsible has not been completely ruled out by investigators, though he remains the only publicly named suspect. The investigation continues to examine other persons of interest, other people who were in the area with concerning backgrounds or behavior. The focus on Brückner is strong, but responsible investigators must keep their minds open to the possibility that they're wrong about him, despite the compelling circumstantial case. The evolution of the McCann family's relationship with media has been complex. Initially, they sought media coverage to spread awareness of Madeleine's disappearance. They gave interviews, released photographs, and appealed for public help. As the investigation turned toward them with suspicion, the media became hostile, and they withdrew from public engagement. Later, they returned to selective media participation, using carefully chosen interviews and documentaries to keep Madeleine's case alive while trying to control the narrative. Today, they're more cautious about media, participating when they believe it will help but protecting their privacy and that of their children. The role of faith and spirituality in helping the McCann family cope has been significant, particularly for Kate. She has spoken about how her Catholic faith provides comfort and framework for understanding suffering. The question of why God would allow such suffering is one theologians have grappled with for centuries, and Kate has publicly wrestled with this question. Her faith hasn't provided easy answers, but it has provided a community of support and a set of practices that help her cope with the ongoing trauma. The impact of this case on how other parents think about vacation safety cannot be overstated. The decision to leave children sleeping in a hotel room or apartment while parents dine nearby, once common in European resorts, has become much less acceptable. Parents are more cautious, more worried, more aware of risks that might once have seemed remote. Whether this increased caution is proportional to actual risk is debatable, but the Madeleine McCann case has undeniably changed parenting culture around holiday safety. The legal complexities of investigating a crime that crosses borders have been on full display in this case. Different countries have different laws about evidence, different procedures for witness interviews, different standards for what constitutes sufficient proof to bring charges, and different approaches to how investigations are conducted. Harmonizing these differences to create an effective international investigation has been challenging and has sometimes led to delays, miscommunications, and frustrations for everyone involved. The question of whether there will ever be a trial, either of Christian Brückner or anyone else, for Madeleine's disappearance is the ultimate unknown. German prosecutors continue to say they're working to build a case they can bring to court. The evidentiary threshold is high, as it should be in any justice system that protects the innocent. But the longer time passes, the more difficult building such a case becomes. Witnesses die or forget. Evidence degrades. The chances of a dramatic breakthrough decrease, though they never disappear entirely. The McCann family's decision to have more children after Madeleine disappeared was controversial to some observers but understandable to anyone who considers their situation compassionately. They already had twin children, who needed their parents present and functional. Having more children or not was a deeply personal decision that outsiders had no right to judge. The family chose to continue living as fully as possible while never giving up on finding Madeleine or learning what happened to her. The archives of media coverage of this case are enormous and provide a record of how society responds to such tragedies. The evolution of the coverage, from sympathetic to suspicious to balanced, reflects broader issues about media responsibility, public fascination with crime, and the intersection of journalism and justice. Future historians and media scholars will study this case as an example of media's power and the ethical challenges of covering ongoing criminal investigations. The possibility that this case will be solved after the deaths of Kate and Jerry McCann is real and deeply sad. They've devoted 18 years to finding Madeleine, but they may not live to see resolution. The investigation could continue for decades more, eventually perhaps solved by some breakthrough long after the parents are gone. This possibility must weigh on them as they age, knowing that the questions that have defined their lives may not be answered while they're alive to hear the answers. The role of Madeleine's image, particularly the photograph that became iconic, has been both a blessing and a burden. The image helped ensure her case wasn't forgotten, generated countless tips, and kept public attention focused on finding her. But it also meant Madeleine's face became public property, used in ways the family couldn't control, associated with conspiracy theories and speculation. The image is powerful and memorable, which has helped the search, but it has also meant that Madeleine exists in public consciousness as a frozen moment, a smiling 3-year-old, rather than the 21-year-old woman she would be today. The question of why this case captured public imagination, when so many other missing children cases don't, is complex and uncomfortable. Madeleine was white, blonde, photogenic, from a professional family, and went missing under circumstances that seemed both terrifying and preventable. These factors shouldn't make her case more important than any other missing child, but they clearly affected how much attention the case received. Acknowledging this uncomfortable reality is important in understanding how society decides which victims deserve attention and resources. The investigative techniques used in this case have evolved over 18 years. Early investigation relied on traditional methods: witness interviews, forensic analysis, CCTV review, and database checks. Later investigation incorporated cell phone tower analysis, social media investigation, advanced DNA techniques, and international intelligence sharing. Future investigation may employ artificial intelligence, advanced satellite imagery analysis, and technologies we haven't yet imagined. The case spans the transition from 20th century to 21st century investigative methods. The emotional exhaustion of investigators who have worked on this case for years is palpable in interviews and statements. They want to solve it. They believe they should be able to solve it. They may even believe they know who's responsible. But they cannot close the case, cannot bring charges, cannot provide the closure that everyone seeks. This frustration, repeated across hundreds of investigators over 18 years, represents an enormous investment of professional dedication and personal emotional energy. The question of whether Christian Brückner will ever be charged with any crime related to Madeleine's disappearance remains open. German prosecutors continue to investigate and say they haven't given up on building a prosecutable case. But with each passing month, the likelihood of finding new evidence that could meet the high German standard for prosecution decreases. The case may remain in this frustrating limbo. A strong suspect, a solid theory, but insufficient proof for criminal charges. The impact of this case on the McCann family's other children, Sean and Amelie, has been significant throughout their lives. They've grown up with the knowledge that they have a sister who disappeared. They've lived with media attention, security concerns, and the emotional weight of their parents' ongoing grief and search. They've been remarkably resilient. But the full impact of growing up in these circumstances can only be understood by them. As they've reached adulthood, they've begun to speak more about wanting privacy and the right to define themselves apart from their sister's disappearance. The annual anniversaries of Madeleine's disappearance have become markers of time for many people who followed the case. Each May 3rd brings renewed media coverage, new appeals for information, and reflection on how much time has passed without answers. For the McCann family, these anniversaries are particularly painful, marking another year without Madeleine, another year of questions without answers, another year of birthdays and Christmases and ordinary moments that should have included all three of their children. The case file for Madeleine McCann's disappearance is one of the largest ever compiled for a single missing person case. It contains tens of thousands of pages of documents, thousands of witness statements, forensic reports, investigative summaries, tips from the public, and analysis by experts in numerous fields. The sheer volume of information is both an asset, because it means every possible angle has been explored, and a challenge, because finding needles of crucial evidence in such an enormous haystack of information is extraordinarily difficult. The question of what evidence German prosecutors have that they haven't made public is one of the most intriguing aspects of the current investigation. They've stated they have evidence pointing to Brückner's involvement and to Madeleine's death, but they've been deliberately vague about specifics. This could be strategic, preventing Brückner from knowing exactly what they have and constructing a defense around it. Or it could reflect the weakness of their evidence strong enough to create suspicion but not strong enough to withstand scrutiny in court. The parallel investigations by three countries have sometimes been complementary and sometimes competitive. British, Portuguese, and German investigators don't always agree on theory, approach, or the significance of various pieces of evidence. This lack of complete coordination has led to criticism, but it also means the case is being examined from multiple perspectives, which could ultimately be beneficial if different approaches yield different insights that collectively solve the case. The financial cost of the investigation across all three countries is likely somewhere around £20 million or more, making it one of the most expensive missing person investigations in history. This expenditure has been justified by authorities as appropriate, given the seriousness of the case, the international dimension, and the public interest. Critics argue that resources on this scale devoted to one case inevitably mean fewer resources for other cases. There's no easy resolution to this debate about how society should allocate investigative resources. The possibility of a breakthrough coming from an unexpected source remains real. Many cold cases are solved by information that emerges years or decades later from sources that had no connection to the original investigation. Someone might come forward with information they didn't realize was significant. Someone might confess on their deathbed. New technology might reveal something in evidence that was collected years ago but couldn't be properly analyzed then. These possibilities keep hope alive, that even now, 18 years later, the case could be solved. The McCann family's decision to pursue every credible lead, no matter how slim the chances, reflects their unwillingness to give up while any possibility of finding Madeleine remains. They've followed up on reported sightings across multiple continents. They've met with psychics, despite skepticism about such methods. They've employed private investigators when official investigations seemed to slow. This relentless pursuit has cost them financially, emotionally, and in terms of time and energy. But they felt they had no choice, that giving up would be abandoning their daughter. The broader societal questions raised by this case about child safety, parenting judgment, media responsibility, investigative priorities, and international cooperation will continue to be relevant long after the specific details of Madeleine's disappearance have faded from public consciousness. The case has become a touchstone for discussing these larger issues, a concrete example that illustrates abstract principles about how society protects its most vulnerable members and responds when that protection fails. This is where we are, 18 years after Madeleine McCann disappeared from apartment 5A in Praia da Luz. We have 3 active investigations in 3 countries. We have a named suspect who prosecutors believe is responsible but cannot charge. We have a family that continues to search and hope despite almost 2 decades of disappointment. We have millions of people worldwide who remember Madeleine's face and wonder what happened to her. And we have questions, so many questions, that remain unanswered. What really happened on the night of May 3, 2007? Who took Madeleine McCann? Where is she now? Is she still alive? Raised by someone else with no memory of her real identity? Or did she die 18 years ago? And if so, where is her body? What evidence do German prosecutors have that makes them so certain of Brückner's involvement? Will that evidence ever be sufficient to bring charges? Will there ever be a trial? Will there ever be justice? These questions may never be answered. The case may remain forever unsolved. One of those mysteries that haunts us precisely because we came so close to answers but never quite reached them. Or perhaps tomorrow, next week, next year, there will be a breakthrough. Someone will come forward with information. New technology will reveal something crucial. Christian Brückner will confess. Evidence will be found. And finally, after 18 years of searching and questioning and hoping and grieving, the McCann family and the millions of people worldwide who followed this case will learn the truth about what happened to Madeleine. Until that day, if it ever comes, the investigation continues. The search goes on. And the hope, however slim, remains that Madeleine McCann will be found and that the person responsible for her disappearance will face justice. If this case has gripped you the way it's gripped millions of people around the world for 18 years, I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to the Untold Crime Cases. We're committed to bringing you the most comprehensive coverage of cases like this. Cases where justice hasn't been served. Cases where families are still searching for answers. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates on the Madeleine McCann investigation or any of the other untold crime cases we cover. Drop a comment below telling us what you think happened to Madeleine. Share this video with anyone who's followed this case, or anyone who cares about unsolved mysteries and the search for justice. The more people who know Madeleine's story, the greater the chance that someone, somewhere has the information that could finally solve this case. Let's keep Madeleine's story alive. Let's keep the pressure on investigators. Let's ensure that this case is never forgotten until it's solved. Subscribe now to the Untold Crime Cases, because every unsolved case deserves our attention, and every missing child deserves to be found. Thank you for watching. And remember, the truth is still out there waiting to be discovered.